The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Turkey at Crossroads, Economic Crisis, Earthquakes, and Elections with Professor Reşat Kasaba. Dr. Kasaba is an expert in the history and politics of the Middle East. He has written and edited 7 books and is an award-winning professor at the University of Washington, where he has taught undergraduate and graduate students for over 30 years.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. This is my first time in Juneau, and I am so glad that I got to spend today seeing the place, and I'm really grateful that so many of you have shown up for Friday afternoon to hear about elections in Turkey. So May 14th, which is a little less than 2 weeks now, actually, there will be an election in Turkey that will be for President and National Assembly. If none of the candidates get 51% of the vote, then there will be a second round 2 weeks after that on May 28th. This is a very important election. It is significant. Its results will be significant for the country, for the region, and also for the U.S. foreign policy. Turkey today is the 21st largest economy in the world. It has the second largest army in NATO, and obviously it is located in a very important place in terms of geography, and it is playing a very central role in the Ukraine war. Now, this election is interesting because for the first time in his 20 years political life as the leader of the country, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is in danger of losing his power. This is after something like 13 elections that he has won since late 1990s, and he has literally become the most powerful politician in modern Turkey. He has become the personification of the state and the country. So why is he in trouble now after all this time? There are 2 reasons, and I will talk about them. The first is economy, which has been an issue even for a while now, and it has been a major issue that people think will be hard for him to combat. But before that now, there is even a more important reason that undermines his power, and that is the earthquake that happened in about 3 months ago in Turkey. Earthquake, and also the difficulty or incompetence of the government agencies in dealing with the aftermath of the earthquake. I'm going to start with earthquake and then come back to the economy because it is much more recent and I think a lot more pressing issue right now. So the earthquake itself, I'm sure you know, was a really major event, once in a century, once in a generation, biblical dimensions really in terms of its destruction. It affected, one way or another, over 13 million people in Turkey. And 300,000 buildings were destroyed, and the area that has been damaged by the earthquake is about as large as the country of Bulgaria. Now, the official death count is about 50,000, but the real number, if it ever comes up, and it comes up, will probably be closer to 100,000. Now, the earthquake itself was big, and it is a natural disaster in some ways. But what was also somewhat really shocking was how unprepared the Turkish government was to deal with this. And that is surprising because there has been warnings that there would be a big earthquake because Turkey sits in the middle of these really serious faults. And it was not unexpected, but it's a lot of things like this, people knew it was going to happen, but they kept hoping that it wouldn't be in their lifetime. And it really hit 11 urban centers, some of them quite large, And the destruction was so large, so huge, even though there has been special laws in the last 20 years that was supposed to put all kinds of restrictions how buildings were supposed to be built. There were special taxes that were collected from constructors for builders for earthquakes specifically. But when it came, all these buildings, new and old, and especially the ones that have been built in the last 20 years or so, just fell down like cardboard boxes. And the number of dead was so high because earthquake came at 4 a.m. in the morning when a lot of people were sleeping. So when you ask the question why Turkey was so unprepared, why the earthquake was so destructive, one answer that people give is all the corruption that went into the construction industry. And that is true, and I'll say a few more things about that in a few minutes. And in recent years, a lot of the construction was really subpar because of all the bribery and other kinds of things that went on. But there's also a longer-term problem. We are going to celebrate next fall 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923. In 1923, 80% of people in Turkey were living in rural areas, villages and small towns, and only 20% were in urban areas. Today, those numbers are reversed. 80% of Turkish people are living in cities now, urban centers, and only 20% are living in rural areas. And this wave of urbanization that developed so fast, of course, brought with it this need to build fast to house these people. So there's a long-term problem in the construction in urban areas that was done very, very fast, and it included all kinds of abuse and theft and corruption. So it's not the story of only the last 10 years. It's something that has been going on for a long time. But under the current regime, since the turn of the 21st century, this kind of corruption that is related to construction industry reached new heights. Construction became one of the centerpieces of Turkey's economic growth recently. All the roads and bridges and tunnels and airports and shopping centers that have been built, they're glittering, they're really attractive buildings that were built, most of them were built by a handful of contractors who are very close to the government. And they have received all kinds of sweetheart deals to build these very profitable arrangements. And of course, in all these deals, a lot of the requirements were ignored, avoided, and there were special amnesties that made it possible for people to go ahead with these, waivers, etc. So looking for it from outside, there was a lot of construction, a lot of growth and development, but underneath it, there was this corroding effects of these relationships. So Turkey then still has, and it is now a big source of concern for a lot of people, for cities like Istanbul, for example, that is also at the center of a very major earthquake fault, that a similar earthquake would cause even bigger tragedy. So that is really, this really very bad housing stock is, I think, one reason why this earthquake ended up being so destructive. And the other issue that came very obvious after the February 6th earthquake is that how hallowed the government and its institutions have become under Recep Tayyip Erdogan's rule. He has moved Turkey towards an executive presidency in 2017. And after that, he has moved to concentrate all power in his hands. Independent judiciary, the press, legislature, and all those things are now under his single control. And people who have little to no no qualifications are appointed to important positions in government institutions just as a result of their relations to people in the center of political power. So agencies like Disaster and Emergency Management Administration or Red Crescent, and all these agencies are run by people who have no background in disasters or rescue or anything like that. Even the military, it turned out, is really a poor, really pale shadow of its former self in many ways. In 1999, there was another earthquake in Turkey. That one was outside of Istanbul. There were about 17,000 deaths. Then it was very big for its time. Within 24 hours, apparently 65,000 soldiers were mobilized to help. This time around, even after 3 days, there were barely 7,000 soldiers helping the people under the rubble. Part of the reason for this, of course, is making sure these institutions are under central control, and also a system where they can't really do anything without the president's approval. Some people say that Erdogan signs his name over 100 times a day. That turns into something like 36,000 signatures a year. Every single thing that happens in Turkish government has to go through his approval. Even a cook who's employed in an embassy in Malaysia cannot be employed without the president's signature. So as a result of this situation after the earthquake, nobody could do anything until they heard from the president. So that meant that people were left under the rubble for maybe as many as 3 days. And people tell these stories of these cries and cries for help and wailing that's coming under this destruction. And nobody showed up for the longest time. And even people who wanted to act independently, civil society organizations, etc., were either prevented or they were really criticized for jumping ahead of the curve and then trying to do things on their own. So that is really reflects a paralysis in the government now that is very centralized. And the centralization, this executive presidency, was established with the promise that it would make Turkish government more efficient, better able to react to these things. And obviously it didn't work out that way. So much so that over 3 months later, there are still over 1 million people living in tents in the earthquake zone. A lot of rubble has not been removed. And then there is also assumption that a lot of that rubble still includes human remains that were never really found or identified. So, so that again is a very important factor that really undermined Erdogan's power and really remains as a major reason why his re-election now is not as certain as it would have been. Now the second reason has a little longer background history, and that is the economic crisis which Turkey has been living under for a while now. Now this represents a reversal, because when Erdogan came to power in 2002, and even when he became mayor of Istanbul in 1992, even before that, he represented himself and his party as a modest but competent group of people. And that was their selling point. And in the first 10 years of his government, they did deliver quite a bit. At some point, Turkey was close to becoming the 6th largest economy in the world in 2013. And it was growing fast. It grew fast. And not only it grew fast, but it also provided very important services to his constituency, poorer segments of the society, and most importantly, regions outside Istanbul, the provincial centers, really benefited from his rule in that time period. But also at that time period, he also was in charge of a kind of a program of social liberalization that included opening up to Kurds, bringing all kinds of really multiple voices into Turkish civil society. Even there was a very serious effort to mend the ties with Turkey's Armenian community and the sad history that is involved in that relationship. So, so that was the first part of his rule, and obviously something happened, and things really turned. And what happened? Actually, it wasn't one thing; it was 3 or 4 separate things together that created an environment, a situation where I think he was quite concerned about his political survival. First of all, I mean, something that people forget, that Turkey was really, literally very close to becoming a full member of the European Union. It was accepted as an associate member. There was a lot of excitement, and there was, and normally now, most countries become full members after they become an associate member. So that actually relationship with European Union was very important for Turkey's liberalization in all kinds of ways. And Europe, for its own domestic reasons, put an end to that process. It was completely something that was initiated by France especially. For domestic political reasons, they started saying things like, well, a Muslim country cannot really be a member of the European Union, so they can become a special partner, an associate member, etc. So that was a very important turnaround, and that really, really made things very difficult for Erdogan domestically. So that was one thing, but that wasn't the only thing. The other was the way the Arab Spring unfolded. Erdogan assumed that the tide of history in the Arab world would be towards the overthrow of existing regimes and coming into power parties and groups with Islamic pasts that were kind of similar to Erdogan. He thought he would be a major player in a post-Arab Spring Middle East. And as you know, after a very promising beginning, all those revolutions fizzled out, they turned back, and most importantly, the Syrian civil war not only sucked Turkey into it, but really made things very difficult for Erdogan, both domestically and internationally. And it continues to do that. And this just excluding the close to 4 million refugees who are still in Turkey now, which makes Turkey the largest refugee hosting country in the world. So, so that is the second. And the third is there was a big demonstration in Istanbul in 2013 that started to protest as a protest for protecting a green area where the government was planning to build a shopping mall. And this kind of demonstration was around environmental issues quickly grew and became an area, a platform for all kinds of people who had demands and criticism, expectations to show up and demonstrate. It went on for almost 2 months. It was like a public festival. And there was a long period of anticipation about how the government would respond to this. And Erdogan was at such a point at the time that it would be completely unsurprising if he responded in a way to really talk to these people, figure out what's going on, and reach an accommodation. It would fit with part of his history. But what he did is exactly the opposite. He used force to disperse these people and really said that this is not a spontaneous demonstration, but it is something that is planned by Turkey's enemies outside, and its goal has nothing to do with the environment or the green space, etc. So that became for him a symbol, and I think it really scared him on some level how many people were out there demonstrating against the government, and that was really for the first time he was facing that kind of public expression. So that is the third. And finally, the attempted coup in 2016, which was organized in a big way by his former ally, Fethullah Gülen, and his movement. It has a long and sorry history, but that coup was even more than Gezi, something that really was quite scary. Even for people who were not involved in it in any way. Literally, you had planes bombing the Turkish National Assembly. Over 200 people were killed, and it was obviously a result of a fairly widespread conspiracy. So those four events, I think, pushed Erdogan in a totally different place. After a long period when economic policy was something that he was exercising to really create a new kind of economic basis for a transformation of Turkish society and economy, after this period, economy became something he started to use to ensure his own political survival. So it became a tool for his own politics. He became obsessed with maintaining a very high rate of growth for Turkish economy. And he tried to do this by borrowing a lot of money and again investing even more in these big construction projects, which created a lot of employment, a lot of economic activity, but really some of them are these vanity projects, but that was the activity, main activity. And also another part was to continue to promote consumption in Turkey as part of economic growth. So this is an interesting place in economic crisis. These policies of big constructions meant that Turkish industry was importing a lot of things, which meant that it had to pay for these imports all the time, which meant that there were these huge deficits in Turkey's current account, and which meant that all these spending, both in industry and in consumption, meant that inflation in Turkey started to go up. From a place where you had 2 to 3%, 4% inflation, this year, by year's end, it'll be close to 60%. Last year it was 80%. And these are official rates, and the real rates are likely to be even higher. Despite this, because of all this spending, Turkish economy also grew by 5.6% in 2022. So that is the number he focuses on. All these countries are still, after COVID, are growing by 1%, 2% for very good reasons, because they want to protect other parts of their economies, whereas Turkey is growing so fast because of his very good policies. So, and this, to continue this process, of course, with these shaky foundations in Turkey is making more and more difficult for Turkey to bring in foreign money for investment in the country. So for that, he has turned to his supporters in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and even Russia, who are providing funds to prop up Turkish economy, which is one way for them to support, to prop up Erdogan's regime. Now, the plan was that this kind of policy would continue until the elections, and after the elections, things would have to be done, but the hope was a high rate of growth would lead them to kind of promise better futures, etc., and get over the elections and pass through. So earthquake, in a sense, really was a big kind of problem for this plan. So it became impossible really to continue in that path because the earthquake itself now has created all kinds of needs, economic needs. The cost of rebuilding sometimes is expected to be about $100 billion, which is 1/9 of Turkey's gross domestic product. So that is the money that will take to rebuild all the buildings and the roads and infrastructure that is being destroyed. And some of the towns that were hit by the export are also important export centers. And obviously their economies are also hurt, and that is also another blow to the economy. So that together then, those two things, I think provide a real kind of realistic kind of reasons to expect these elections to be more difficult for Erdogan than it was anticipated earlier. But then what is likely to happen? How exactly do we think elections will come out, and what role these events will play? Now, like everything else, there is no one answer. And since this is being recorded, I'm not going to tell you what will happen because I will probably be proven wrong. So let's see the kinds of things we should watch, and maybe those will tell us what to expect. Interestingly, I mean, I told you a few minutes ago that part of Erdogan's economic policies were focused on provinces, places outside of big cities. And the earthquake zone contains some of these places. These are some of the places that got hit by this earthquake are among his strongest supporters, were among his strongest supporters. They received a lot of economic help from the policies of this government, and they really became places where there's a viable middle class, and that's an important change from earlier times. So the biggest question that nobody knows is, these people are angry, obviously, but how angry are they? Will they turn that anger into their ballots? Will they vote? Who will they vote? How will they express what they went through, the anger about what they went through? So we don't know that. And also, there is a very, one of the institutions that Erdogan really established a very close control over is Turkish media. One result of this has been that in recent weeks, there has hardly been any mention of the earthquake and its aftermath in the major newspapers and television stations. So people like me who know people who follow these events know how bad things still are in those places. But that's not being discussed in Turkey anymore in the media. Instead, this press that is very close to the president is talking about how great Turkey is, that it's now building airplane carriers and fighter jets and all these new investments in these showy big things and electric cars. They got an Italian firm to build an electric car, and they call it the Turkish electric car, which you can buy cheaply if you want. There aren't that many charging stations, but that'll come later. But this is the image there is. So with that kind of control, of course, the effect, what role the earthquake and economic crisis will play is hard to predict for us looking at it from outside. And of course, a lot of it also depends on the opposition. There are major rivals. There are 4 candidates for president, but really, in addition to Erdogan, the major opposition figure is Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. His name is not easy to pronounce for non-Turkish speakers, but I hope that all of you will learn soon how to pronounce, because you will have to pronounce this. So Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu comes from a very modest background. He's a government economist who worked in Turkish Social Security Administration for a long time, and after retiring got into politics. Very quiet, modest, as I said, unassuming, very difficult very different from our current president. And among other things, unexpectedly, he has managed to pull together 6 parties into a coalition to support him. And this coalition, unlike earlier Turkish elections, represent a truly diverse group of political parties. From parties that come from Islamist background to parties that come from extreme nationalist background. But in addition to those, he also managed one of Turkey's biggest parties that represent the interests of Turkey's Kurdish community to support him in the presidential election. So that is one of the reasons why people are cautiously optimistic about what's likely to happen. So people give him a lot of credit for bringing this coalition together, and not only just as a group of people, but really getting them to agree on a set of measures that they commit to undertake to move Turkey away from this extremely centralized presidential system. So there's an agreement about that, and they promise to implement that. So so that is it. So now the other question, of course, everybody is asking is what happens if he loses, if Erdogan loses? Will he just move, leave quietly, or if is he going to pull Trumpian or Bolsonaro type of thing in Turkey? Now, I don't really expect that because one of the things that is interesting about Turkey is, despite this long history of political turmoil, military coups, periods of extreme political strife, there is a very deeply established culture of elections in Turkey. They have been going on regularly since 1946, and Turks have come to expect that their votes will matter. So there is really, when you look at the campaign now, it's a genuine campaign. It is not the kind of thing like we used to see in Egypt, for example. Mubarak kept getting 99.9% of the vote in these elections that they held. So things like that don't happen, and I don't think is likely to happen. So there is a genuine election. So that's one thing we should keep in mind. Now, the other is still, I think it depends in some ways to the margin of victory. If the margin is very close, this happened in 2018. There were mayoral elections in Istanbul, which were very important for the ruling party, Erdogan, because his first victory was to win the mayoralty of Istanbul, and he kept saying that if you lose Istanbul, you lose Turkey. And that when it turned out that they lost Istanbul, he found a legal reason to have a do-over. And shortly after that election, they had another election just to do it again, because he says some ballots were not counted, some things were different. And then in the second one, he lost by even a larger margin. So that has become a very important symbol of what's likely to happen. He's never really gotten over that, actually. It's a big source of sorry for him, sadness. But if it is very close, you can expect some kind of objection, something. Another thing that is troublesome is, I told you there are 2 rounds for the presidential election. And if none of the candidates get, because there are two other candidates, they will get some, very little, but some votes. So if nobody gets more than 50% in the first round, there will be a second round. And there are 2 weeks between the first and the second round. And given everything that is under the control of the central government now under Erdogan, there are a lot of things that he can do in those 2 weeks. In terms of its foreign policy, in terms of domestic issues, in terms of all kinds of things. There are just so many things that are controlled by him. So that would become crucial. So it is important if we want a different kind of future for the country, it is important to hope for a big win in the first round rather than a protracted struggle. So, those are the things that we should keep in mind about the election, its likely outcome. Now, another thing I think we should consider is, let's suppose that this coalition somehow won, and then they pulled it off and they won the elections, and what is likely to happen? I think on one level, I mean, there are certain things that are likely to happen that are very important for Turkey. By controlling the judiciary in the way that he does, Erdogan has imprisoned some very important intellectuals, journalists, civil society leaders, political leaders. And I mentioned this Kurdish party. Kurdish party, actually, in terms of its constituency, it's the third largest party in the country. Selahattin Demirtas, who was its president, has been in prison for 6 years with no obvious charges, just claiming that he was supporting terrorism. And there are other people like that. So one thing that we can expect is that all those people will be released. I think that will be very important for the health of Turkey's society, because this kind of fear that has prevailed over the country for so long, I think has been very bad for interpersonal relations, for brain drain. Anybody who has any kind of opportunity is leaving the country, and so that is really making a lot of people very pessimistic. So that is one thing we can immediately expect. Now, for the longer term results, so what else is likely to happen? We can first of all think about foreign policy. So one of the things that Erdogan has done, which is very different from all the previous Turkish governments, is that he has taken advantage of the vacuum that exists in the Middle East today, and that really developed since the end of the Cold War, and it has gotten significantly worse in the aftermath of the Iraq War. He has taken advantage of that vacuum, and he stepped in as a major player in especially the Middle East. And he has used his position in that part of the world very effectively as a leverage. There is no chance of getting into the European Union, but he is paid something like, well, I'd say he, but Turkey is paid something like 3 billion euros to keep the Syrian refugees in Turkey, to prevent them from going on to Greece and Europe, other parts of Europe. So this whole refugee policy that the European Union has a lot of things, a lot of aspects that's very embarrassing. They do the same thing with Libya, paying Libya to keep people from going into Europe. So, but he has been using his position. He's been using that position, as some of you know, to hold these endless negotiations about Finland's and Sweden's membership in NATO. And he has managed to block Sweden's membership now for a very long time. And those are very important for him to do for domestic reasons. Those make him look for his domestic constituents as the strong kind of leader that protects Turkey's interests. And it has also come with a heavy dose of not only Europe and West, but also anti-Americanism. And these are the kinds of things that shape Turkey's foreign policy. He's also used the same position in the Ukraine war. On the one hand, he sells drones to Ukraine, but at the same time, he also has very close relations with Putin and hasn't really gone along with the US sanctions towards Putin. And Turkey has become one of the safest harbors for all the yachts and the money that all those oligarchs have. They're all parked in Turkey now. So that uses this position. So what are we to expect from a new government if there is a change after the elections? I think in terms of foreign policy, it will be a lot more friendly government to especially Europe. I think the relations with European Union will become a lot more important for this group than it has been in the last at least 10 years under Erdogan. So that'll be an important change. I don't really expect any radical change in terms of this protecting Turkey's interests, and I think that's a function of the difficulty that the region itself is going through. But I think it'll be a much less confrontational kind of relationship with the West in general. Finally, I also want to say something about that coalition. It is, I said, it's a six-party coalition with very diverse groups of people, parties that are represented in it. And that makes a lot of people very hopeful about the future of the country. But at the same time, you can imagine that once these immediate issues are resolved, these six parties will try to pull the country in six different directions. So that can create problems in terms of governing, in terms of coming up with a viable economic plan, coming up especially with a policy towards the Kurdish minority. And these are all unknowns that we don't know. Right now, the best way I think that summarizes where we are is that there is more than enough reason to be cautiously optimistic. And cautiously optimistic for something that will end. But in terms of what will come after that, I think that is still unknown, and that I will come back to Juneau in a year or so, and we can consider what's going on. So thank you very much for coming. I think we have about 12 minutes or so for questions, and as Bruce mentioned, there's a microphone there, so because of recording, you are asked to go to the microphone.
Yeah. Queue up. We can have multiple people in line so we can keep it going. Hello. First, I apologize if I'm misperceiving the geopolitics of Turkey. I'm no expert or anything. I just have these impressions that I formed. Yeah. But I wonder, I believe Erdogan, there's been a decades-long, well, almost 100 years long tradition of, starting with Ataturk, where Ataturk started the new Turkey and sort of embraced the West and specifically tried to create a secular society, or at least a separation of like mosque and state, so to speak. And I believe Erdogan in recent years is pushing back, sort of rejects that. I mean, it's a big thing.
Yeah.
It's a huge difference in perspective between what the view that has been shared by Turkish governments for almost 100 years and Erdogan appears to reject. Is that a factor in the election? Is there any popular view or consensus or pushback against Erdogan's rejection of Ataturk in the West, so to speak? All the reforms that Ataturk did is sort of viewed with disfavor now. How does that affect the elections?
The very important question. You are right, but the turn in Erdogan towards a more pious and more Islamic, more kind of religious kind of way of doing things, I mean, this really in Turkey translates into public expressions of religion. So seeing more people covered and prayers are now very important and whatever. So but that turn really became especially pronounced after that crisis period that I mentioned, the last 10 years or so. So one of the debates in Turkey, some people say, well, he meant to do this all along. He was waiting for the right moment. That may be, but the first 10 years of his rule was very different. It was in rhetoric, I mean, he presented himself as something that was actually improving what came before by including more people who had been excluded from that secular project. So people could become part of a democratic Turkey without having to give up their prayers and their religious beliefs. And by becoming part of this community, they would draw all kinds of benefits from it, and especially economic benefits. Because the secular project, when you look back to it, it was a project that excluded very large sections of Turkish society. So that is true. So he was giving voice to that was always a very important part of his political rhetoric. He is still using that, but the unknown is, given the seriousness of economic crisis, given inflation, etc., how far that will carry him. And that's why I said I don't know how these people will vote, people who used to support him, because they are suffering from inflation. They are now suffering from the earthquake. And so in that kind of sense, it's no longer a very clear divide. Plus, in the coalition I mentioned, there are two parties that split from Erdogan's party, and a third one that comes directly from Turkey's Islamist politics. So that is another kind of situation, and that is very different from the old elections where you had a very clear divide from the secular and the religious. So it is, in a way, rather than turning back, there are a lot of reasons for seeing this as an evolution of that model. But that is true that he is increasingly relying on that rhetoric because all the other things are not there anymore.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm sorry to say I haven't been in Turkey since March of 1969.
Oh, wow.
So thank you for being here and bringing
Sure.
us the news.
Yeah, changed a lot. But yeah.
Two questions. To what extent was the Syria war caused by the degradation to the economy, particularly agriculture, because of climate change? And did the same thing happen in Turkey? Mm-hmm. Is that one of the causes for the economic difficulties even before 2013, I think,
yes.
what you said was kind of a turning point.
Yeah.
And second question, what about the Kurds?
Yes.
Are they ever going to get their own country?
Yes.
And how do they go about that?
Yeah, okay. So potentially subjects for two further lectures. But I'll say very quickly, climate change, you're absolutely right, was a very important factor in the beginning of the Syrian civil war. That's absolutely true. It has not been such a big thing in Turkey. It's not. It's partly because For one thing, there is this big system of dams that were built in southeastern Turkey that plays a role. But where climate issues become problematic is some of these construction projects threaten to degrade the soil and create all kinds of problems with wildlife and all those places. So people are concerned about that. So that is one. Now the Kurds, of course, is a very big issue. That is, as the new republic was established in 1923, what was formerly a very diverse society with Greeks and Armenians and Jews and Kurds and Arabs and other ethnic groups and religious groups became a much more homogeneous in terms of religion and ethnicity. So Armenians, a lot of them were murdered and expelled. The same thing, Greeks were expelled, exchanged. Kurds remained. They were the only major non-Turkish Muslim group that remained within Turkey, but their identity was never recognized until very recently as a distinct group. So they were subjected to a very attempted assimilation project to remove them from their homelands and forcing them to use Turkish, forbidding them from speaking Kurdish and language. So it was a sad period, and it is 20% of Turkey's population. You know. It's large. But in terms of a separate country, the main issue, of course, is Kurds are not only in Turkey, but they're also in Iraq, and they're in Iran, and they're in Syria also. But a largest part of them are in Turkey. But these divisions, both in Turkey and across the borders, also have very important linguistic differences, tribal differences. So it's very hard, impossible to imagine all of those groups coming together and forming a national movement for an independent state. And for Kurds in Turkey, especially in the last 20 years or so, the aim has been more in terms of a cultural autonomy rather than a political independence. So their goal has been more in terms of expressing their interests, being able to practice their culture, etc., but doing it as part of a larger community. And they are, I mean, the fact that there are two parts of it. There is a militant group that has been fighting a guerrilla war or some sorts, PKK, and there is a political party that I mentioned, has been in the parliament, Turkish parliament, is a very important player in Turkish politics, and that I think has been a very healthy development for Turkey too. Yeah.
I don't see anyone behind me. I'll ask a third question.
That's fine, yes,
Do you think
unless
if-
somebody objects. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think if there's a change in the regime that many expatriates will return home? I think especially of the technically competent people. I've encountered many of them in energy conferences. So there must be a lot of good engineers
Yes.
out there who would like to come home. Do you think they will?
Yes. I think it will take not just a regime change, but a very dedicated kind of recruitment effort, because the good people, especially in certain fields, are outside the country also because they are being recruited by important companies and countries. So that has to be a very directed effort to pull them back. One group that is very interesting actually is doctors. A lot of doctors are leaving Turkey because they really are, the expectations that are placed on doctors is just so harsh that a lot of them are leaving, and that is very sad, especially given the earthquake and things like that. So bringing them back will be, I think, an important task also, but we'll see.
Thank you.
There's one more question there.
This will be the last question.
Yes.
The military, as I understand, has played historically an important role in national politics. You had alluded to the fact that it's been weakened under Erdogan. Do you anticipate, or I guess with the coming election, is there any possibility that the military could step back in and try to take control?
I don't. I don't think anybody expects that at this point. I think there are. One reason is that it has been really restructured, and now it is really, in many ways, under civilian control to a much larger degree than it had been ever in history. Changing that would be very hard. But also, I think the previous interventions of the military in Turkish politics never produced good results. So the memory of each intervention actually is worse than the one that came before. And in fact, the last time that they tried to affect things ended up strengthening Erdogan even further. And that's not the coup attempt, actually. Even before that, that ended up strengthening Erdogan even more than they desire. So they're not really, they don't have a very good track record, but institutionally too now, they're not only weakened, but they're also a different kind of institution. So they don't really, they're not in a position, I don't think, to do much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Reşat Kasaba in this Juno World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded May 5th, 2023 at KTOO in Juneau, with major support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine and the University of Alaska Southeast, and with additional support from AELMP, Hayton Associates, Ramada by Wyndham, Sea Alaska, and Wostman & Associates.